see if this helps. Alright, well that happened way quicker this time. So, we'll see. We'll see what happens. Doesn't look like any fucking notifications have gone out. Yet again. I'm looking at 0 people at 30 seconds live. Okay, yeah, somebody just chatted. It can take a second or two for that to repopulate, so I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens. I guess I'll wait for a little while. Okay. It looks like the plebs are filing in now. I demand satisfaction. I demand satisfaction. What it do? What it do? What it do? Hello. All right. This might be just the same people that were in here before, which sucks. I mean, it doesn't suck. I'm glad they're here, but yeesh. Yeah. So, well, I'll wait around. I mean, it can sometimes take 5 minutes for YouTube to update everything and stuff. So I guess I'll just hang around and we'll shoot the shit with you guys for a few minutes. Yeah, dude. Well, actually, I am a Borgia, so people are conspiring against the Borgias. So I checked my subs and saw you were live. You were live. You were live. I saw you were live. I checked my subs and I saw you were live. Cool. I wish YouTube would send out notifications to the rest of my subs and let them know I was live so I could start talking about what I want to talk about tonight, but I guess that's going to take its time. Yeah, fresh off of just kind of chilling on Twitch. Okay, all right. Now some people are starting to file in. Okay, all right. All right, YouTube. I see what you've done. You've decided to slowly but surely send out my notifications again. We're getting there. We're getting there. I fucking hate YouTube, man. It's like an uphill battle being on this platform. You can't even get them to fucking anyway. I'm not gonna do my bitching about YouTube thing because I end up doing that. Paul, when you first went on DP, did you have any idea what you were getting into? Absolutely not. I don't think anybody could. There's really no way to prep your brain for that. It just, you know. There's no way to prep your body and brain for that kind of job, especially if you've worked normal jobs your whole life like me. I guess, you know, I guess honestly, like, this type of YouTube thing is becoming a more and more normal job. Excluding you, who would be the best actor to portray Pope America the First? Pope America. John Lovitz, dude. We got to bring him out of retirement. John Lovitz is the only man that can do it. All right, well, there's 40 people in here, and probably a lot of the people that normally watch me aren't going to want to watch this anyway, so I might be happy with that number. So I'm going to tell you guys what we're going to be up to tonight. It's going to be a kind of a laid-back stream in terms of what we're used to. But we're going to be listening to Endgame by Derek Jensen together. Because we've talked about philosophy before, and I've discussed his philosophy before, but we've never, really gotten the chance to check it out together. And this is available on YouTube in various formats. This is my favorite delivery of the speech. So we're going to check this out. I'm going to go ahead and turn the desktop audio up here. So Derek Jensen is, if you've kind of hung out in any of my other philosophy streams or pessimism streams, I've talked about Derek Jensen. He's a rewilder. So he's a person that believes that civilization is not sustainable, cannot continue, must not continue for the human race to continue. I don't agree with his conclusions, at least not all of them. But his philosophy was very, very formative to mine. Kind of changed my way of looking at things. And I want to kind of go through this and talk to you about how I feel about each of his points and hear what you have to say about each of his points. So that's kind of what we'll be up to here tonight. If that sounds boring to you, then feel free to fuck right off. I'm going to start watching the video in about 5 more minutes or so. We give people a chance to file in, but just so you know what you're in for. Well, I'll probably won't even wait. I should probably start now, honestly. So I'm going to go ahead and start this. I'm going to pause it probably pretty frequently so that we can discuss what's going on. I'm going to try and get through as much of it as I can tonight. So it's about an hour and 20-minute long speech. And we'll see if we can get through the whole thing before I collapse into sleep. So, yeah, it's like you walked into a uni lecture. Yeah. So let's listen to Derek Jensen here. Yeah, if you don't, like I said, if this is boring to you, feel free to fuck right off.
So I want to talk tonight about Endgame, the book on the reality, and the way, that book really began from a fundamental question of, do you believe that this culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living? And, I've asked that question of thousands of people, and nobody ever says yes. But one guy at one of my talks raised his hand, and everybody looks at him. He said, "Oh, voluntary? No, of course not." And
so I guess I pose that question to you guys. Do you think that society is going to voluntarily change into something that is sustainable? I mean, my answer is no. I wonder how you guys feel about that. Do you think that society is ever going to undergo a voluntary change to something that is sustainable? Okay. So it seems, right, it'll have to be forced upon us by some outside measure. Right. So it seems like we got a maybe. We got one maybe, but it seems like the balance of people in here seem to be on the same page as Derek is here. You think it's going to change when force is applied? I think you're probably correct about that. So let's move on here.
So the next question is, if you don't believe that the culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living, and you care about the land where you live, what does that mean for your strategy and for your tactics? And the answer is we don't really know. And one of the reasons that we don't know is because we don't really talk about it. And one of the reasons that we don't talk about it is because we're all so busy pretending that we have hope. And I'm going to do some serious hope bashing later. It's one of my favorite things to do. So that's really where I want to, and that's really what the book is about, is if you don't believe that the culture is going to undergo a voluntary transformation, what do you do?
Well, he's not talking about society as a great amalgamation of people. He's talking about society in terms of the governments that represent the citizens, right? So when he's saying, do you believe that society or the culture, and I think that's why he chooses the word culture instead of society. He's talking about the culture of consumerism, right? So if I don't need to rewind it. He doesn't say society. He says culture. He says, do you believe that the culture is going to voluntarily go through a change to a sustainable and sane way of living? So that you need to be very explicit here.
And so I think what I would like to do is go through the premises of that book. And one of the things I've done in ENDGAME is I put my premises in boldface in the front of the book. And one of the reasons I did that is because one of the first rules of propaganda is if you can slide your premises by people, you've got them. About Hitler, it was said, from insane premise to monstrous conclusion, Hitler was coldly ideological. So he would say, what are we going to do about the Jewish problem? Gosh, Adolf, good question. What are we going to do about it? But see, what he's done is he's slid the premise by you that there's a Jewish problem you have to do something about. Or similarly, you hear some talking head on television say, so how can we make the U.S. economy grow? God, good question. Well, okay, some of the premises. A, we want the U.S. economy to grow. B, we want the U.S. economy to exist. C, who the hell's we?
So he's got a really good point here about sliding your premises by people. And this is a very old talk. This talk was given in the early 2000s, I believe. So it's going on 20 years old. But this remains something that's very forward in my thinking. That when you're talking to somebody, it's a tactic that floats both ways, right? Begging the question, right? It's a logical fallacy, but it's one that flies under a lot of people's radar. The establishment of a premise allows you a position of strength in an argument. And see here, he's not even warning people away from it. He's telling people why he did it. See, he didn't write this book for the people that are in this room. The people that are in this room are already rewilders. They already agree with him. He wrote this book for us, right? So he's talking to them about how he tried to use that same kind of argument technique to slide his premises by people because he wants to make an impact on the culture. But he's also giving the people who are at this talk an important lesson in propaganda, right? How often? I mean, just try and pay attention to it. Do it as a thought experiment one day. If you're a person that checks in on the news like I do at least once a day, right? If only to check out what the big headlines are. If you watch any news stories, try and keep track in those news stories how many times a premise is slid by you. Or the next time Trump gives a big national speech, listen to it and try and count how many times he just presupposes a premise and slides it right by you. It's an interesting thing and something that's always stuck in my craw from this talk. I love how he's honest about his willingness to use that.
And so, like I said, I didn't want to do that. I don't want to slide premises by people. And so the structure of this talk is going to be that I want to go through some of the premises for that book. And the first premise is that industrial civilization is not, and civilization itself, but especially industrial civilization, is not and can never be sustainable. Civilization is not and can never be sustainable.
So that's the first premise, right? And he's going to go on to explain it a little bit. Maybe we should listen a little bit. So I'm going to let him explain these, and then at the end of this, we'll stop and discuss each premise, okay?
A few years ago, I was riding in a car with a friend of mine we were stuck in traffic, and I was just making conversation, and I said, so George, if you could live at any level of technology that you wanted, what would it be? And George can sometimes kind of be a curmudgeon, and that day was not in a good mood, and he said, Derek, that's a really stupid question. We can fantasize whatever we want, but the truth is there's only one level of technology that's sustainable, and that's the Stone Age. And we're going to be there again someday, and the only question really is what's going to be left of the world when we get there. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that any way of living that's based on the use of non-renewable resources won't last. In fact, it takes anybody but a rocket scientist to figure that out. That before we go any further, it's like, okay, that's nice. What's civilization? And, I've been bashing civilization for about 15 years now, and so I figure I'd probably better finally define it. And the definition that I'm using is that civilization is a way of life that's characterized by the growth of cities. And that's defensible both linguistically and historically. Well, that's nice, Derek, but what's a city? And a city, I've defined as a collection of people living in numbers large enough to require the importation of resources. And what that means is the Tolowa, on whose land I now live, were not civilized. They didn't require the importation of resources. They didn't live in cities. They lived in villages, camps, and once again, they didn't require the importation of resources. They would eat salmon and clams and huckleberry and salal and salmon and salmon and salmon and salmon, and then usually through the winter they would eat a lot of salmon. And the Tolowa lived there for 12,500 years if you believe the myths of science. And if you believe the myths of the Tolowa, then they lived there since the beginning of time. And this culture has been there for 180 years, 170 years, and the area's getting pretty trashed.
So that's a pretty dense little block of information. So I feel like we need to pause and kind of discuss up till this point and see where everybody kind of stands. The first premise is that civilization cannot be, or is not, and will never be sustainable. He defends that by defining civilization as being characterized by the growth of cities, which I think is defensible. I think it might be a slightly simplistic definition of what civilization is, but I think it is defensible. And his definition of a city as any collection of people that's large enough to require the importation of resources. Now, he's not done defending his first premise yet, but I think it's interesting to kind of check in and see what people think about it so far. So I think it's much simpler to say that any animal that must consume resources and has no limiting pressures is unsustainable. I mean, sure, but I think he's kind of copping to the fact that we're a conscious animal, right? So we're a little different. I mean, any animal like that is going to eventually eat itself into starvation, and its numbers are going to normalize, right? So we're an animal that can go outside of that. So if we eat up all our resources, we can go get them from somewhere else. We can fly them over to us on planes and float them to us on boats. I'm agreeing with him so far. When you're talking about finite resources being used, you're of course inherently talking about something that cannot be sustained, right? What if? But he doesn't get into what ifs, and neither do I. What ifs, what ifs, what ifs. What if we had this? What if we had that? Doesn't really. We don't. We don't have Star Trek technology, and we're not going to for some years. And the damage that he's talking about, the ecological damage, is going to just compound. I mean, it's compounded since he gave this talk. I think stating that civilization is unsustainable as an absolute is a small-minded statement, unless you're only talking on the highest macro level of time, like society isn't substance. Yeah, I get what you're saying. However, I think we'll let him defend his position, but it's interesting to see that we got some people that seem to be kind of going with the flow. Any form of consumption is an importation, is it not? No, absolutely not. The example that he gave of the Tolowa Indians that live on the land near the Klamath River that he lives on in Washington or Oregon, I can't remember. It's one of the Pacific Northwest states. Anyway, doesn't matter. the Indians that he was talking about lived on that land for 12,500 years and were not, according to his definition, civilized because they did not require the importation of resources. They lived on the land that they lived on. They didn't require, anything to be brought in. They got everything that they needed from the land, right? So they lived, in the Klamath River Valley. They fished the stream. They ate berries off the bushes. They used local wood and local flora and fauna to build what they needed to survive, and they did. And they stayed pretty much at the same level for 12,500 years. Bet they had great lives. I mean, we don't know. It's one thing for us to look at their lives through the lens of modern technology and go, oh my God, what a bunch of fucking bone through the nose savages. And, oh God, I'd hate to live that way. But I wonder what they would think, I wonder what their perspective would be. Like I said, I think we've talked about this before. If we went back in time and got a Tolowa Indian and brought him to modern society, do you think he'd choose our society, or do you think he'd want to go back to his? I think he'd want to go back to his. So perspective matters, right? Let's let him defend his position a little more here.
And so two things happen as soon as you require the importation of resources. One of them is that your way of living can never be sustainable, because if you require the importation of resources, it means that you've denuded the landscape of that particular resource, and as your city grows, you'll denude an ever larger area. And denuding the landscape of a resource harms the land base. It's very interesting. I know we've all been told that natural selection is based on competition, and that it's all just a fierce battle for who can be the meanest and grab the most resources most quickly and exploit the most thoroughly. But short of showing how stupid our discourse is, I can disprove that in one sentence if you give me a couple of semicolons. And that's those creatures who've survived in the long run have survived in the long run. Semicolon. You don't survive in the long run by hyper-exploiting your surroundings. Semicolon. You survive in the long run by actually making your habitat better. What a concept. Okay, so anyway, two things happen as soon as you...
All right. So, another little sub-premise here. And I don't find myself disagreeing. A species cannot survive if it denudes the landscape that it lives on of all natural resources. That's not how a species survives in the long run. Right? Yeah, man. Thanks, Primus. Yeah, you kind of inspired me to talk about this tonight. Does he make a distinction between renewable and non-renewable resources? He does. He doesn't even really bring renewable resources into this. He's a naturalist, so he's talking about things that we have to take from the earth. So wood, water, the elemental things of the earth that are non-renewable, oil, all kinds of wildlife. He's sliding quite a few premises by. He sure is. But he did tell you he was going to do it. Even if he kind of coyly said, well, I don't want to do that. He slides a few premises by just in explaining his premise. So he's guilty of the same thing he accuses others of course. And you're smart to notice that. That's the problem with climate debate. It's not that the Earth will die. The Earth has gone through way worse things in the past, but the human species will die. Sure. That's really what it's about, right? Yes, eventually the Earth is going to correct itself. Long after we're gone, it's going to heal the scars of humanity, and most of the damage that we've done will be just a distant planetary memory. This is about the survival of the human species. Let's get that straight. We're not talking about saving the world for the world's sake here. Even though you will hear him talk and gush very effusively about nature and its beauty and its balance. He's not really talking about that. He's talking about the survival of the human species. And I think it's interesting and important to make that distinction here. The largest premise he's sliding by is the definition of sustainable, exactly. And, it's a hard thing to do when you're giving a talk like this, to define every term. I think he's doing a valiant job at trying that. But you're right. Sustainability is something that's debatable with some resources, right? And some resources, of course, can be replaced. Non-sustainable resources can be, in some ways, replaced or supplemented by sustainable resources. An example would be solar energy replacing the need for fossil fuels, right? Is it possible to use a combination of geothermal and solar? Maybe not with the technology we have now, but in the future, I think it's pretty safe to say that we could develop solar cells that could replace our need for fossil fuels. If that happens, then we have taken a non-renewable source of energy and turned it into a renewable one. So, his premise doesn't really account for that either. So that's an important thing to note here, right? So let's keep listening.
Require the importation of resources. One is that you can never be sustainable, which means we could all become the best little natural capitalists in the world, and it doesn't matter. So long as there's this fundamental system in place, it's not going to be sustainable. And the other thing it means is that your way of life must be based on violence, because if you require the importation of resources, trade will never be sufficiently reliable. Because if you require the importation of resources and the people in the next watershed over aren't going to trade you for it, you're going to take it, which means we could all become junior bodhisattvas, and it wouldn't matter. The U.S. military would still have to be huge, because how else are they going to get access to our oil that just happens to be under somebody else's land?
So, if this doesn't resonate true to me, then, I don't know what would. This is really where his position gains strength to me. And it's a really important part of my personal philosophy, is in the defining of this first premise, which I may not even agree with totally, honestly. The premise as a whole, I think, may be too flawed for me to say thumbs up to. But in his defense of the premise, he makes this point. The point about, if you have a place like New York City that requires the importation of resources to run, and for some reason, the place that it gets those resources from won't give it to them via normal, peaceful trade, then New York City is going to go get those resources from somebody because it needs them. He's not talking about greed here. He's talking about requiring the importation of resources to sustain a city. And if civilization is characterized by the growth of cities, if you allow him to slide that premise by you, which I'm almost willing to, then what he's saying here really holds a lot of weight. Really, really, really holds a lot of weight. People could choose to downgrade their lives and not exploit other people's resources, but they won't, right? We all agreed. There are a few more of you here now, but early on when we started this, we all agreed with his initial premise that the culture of consumerism and exploitation and capitalism is not going to go through a voluntary change to a sane and sustainable way of life. So we all agreed, all of us at least that were in here at that time, with that premise as it stood. But it seems like we're hitting some roadblocks with people, which is fine. This is like, look, this isn't about really convincing anybody. It's about talking about how I developed. There could be a city that is sustainable without importing anything. Those living there would need to be careful about. Well, I don't think that's true. I don't think it's possible in any way for a modern city to exist without the importation of resources. We're talking about a city that's connected to roads. No, there's just no way. There's absolutely no way. I disagree with you fundamentally on that. I think that anything that didn't require the importation of resources would not be called a city. It'd be called like a camp or an enclave or something like that, it would not be called a city. There's absolutely no way to have a modern city that is sustainable without the importation of resources. A village, yeah, something like that. But there's no such thing here in America. Life itself isn't sustainable, but if he's seeking sustainability, it's only a matter of how long you want to drag life out. We can exist low tech for millions of years or high tech for a fewer number. I think that's kind of the point he's making, right? I really do think that's the point he's making. But let's let him go on here. He's talking, just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page. He's talking about your lifestyle having to be based on violence, if that first part of the premise is true, which I believe it is.
If they require that oil, they're going to take it. So those two things are really fundamental. Because I've been talking about resources, so I want to go back to what I was saying before about any way of life. Another way to look at all this is any way of life that's based on the use of non-renewable resources also won't last. I mean, it doesn't matter what resource you're talking about. You would think that if you have a way of life that's based on the use of, I don't know, let's just choose a random example, oil. You would think that you would start to consider what's going to happen when this non-renewable resource runs out. That, once again, just by definition, any way of life that's based on the use of non-renewable resources won't last. And I would go a step further, and I would say that any way of life that's based on the hyper-exploitation of renewable resources won't last. So if every year there are fewer salmon returned than the year before, eventually you're going to run out. And everybody knows this except for Michael Sissenwine, who is
All right.
in charge of one of the divisions of the National Marine Fisheries Services, and his response when learning that 90% of the large fish in the oceans are gone was to say, that's not a problem. We have to ask what level of decline is reasonable or sustainable. Exactly. And so in basically 2 sentences or 3 sentences, he destroyed the words problem, decline, 2 sentences, he destroyed the words problem, decline, reasonable, and sustainable.
What a profoundly stupid statement, and that is a direct quote, by the way. What level of decline is reasonable or sustainable? He really, he did destroy all of those words, but he destroyed the word decline most of all. Hey, Obi-Wan Stoney. The issue that we have, corporations running everything, fossil fuel companies have fooled us into thinking we need them to survive, but we could replace them. See, we could, but we need to fall back to that his original premise that, once again, all of us seemed to agree with pretty wholeheartedly at the start of this stream, which was that the culture that we live in is not going to voluntarily go through a change to a sustainable and sane way of living. So we're talking about all these things that could happen. Somebody earlier was saying, oh yeah, hemp, man, hemp can replace oil and it's sustainable and renewable. It could, possibly, if we started doing it right now, if we started throwing tons and tons of money on and the most efficient way to turn hemp into usable, combustible energy. We could. We're not going to. That's his point. And I think that point still stands. We are not going to throw our money behind solar or geothermal or hemp or biodiesel or any of these renewable, sustainable energy sources before it's too late. And by the way, before it's too late is already too late. When he gave this talk, we hadn't crossed the point of no return yet. This is a talk that was given before human society crossed the point of no return when it came to climate destruction, right? You have to keep that in mind too. Things have just gotten worse since he gave this talk. So much worse that Derek Jensen of that time would probably have fucking puked his guts out to know how much worse things were going to get. He's still alive, so he can experience that. I feel that humanity will always want the need to be greater than just a one planet species, and we will no matter what, go towards a high tech future that requires resources. I think you're probably right about that. Just look at the barbaric, retarded shit modern humans are still willing to do. The thought that we do something solely because it prolongs our survival seems extremely unlikely. I think you're absolutely right. Let's let him continue.
So in any case, if every year there are fewer passenger pigeons return than there were the year before, eventually there will be none. If every year there's fewer old-growth forest, which once wasn't called old-growth forest but was simply called home, then eventually it will be gone. And I'm going to go a step further, and I'm going to say that any way of life that's based on the use of resources won't last. Because a resource is something there to be used. And there's a great line by a Canadian lumberman: when I look at trees, I see dollar bills. And if when I look at trees, I see dollar bills, I'm going to treat them one way. I'm going to convert them into dollar bills. If when I look at trees, I see trees, I'm going to treat them another way. And if when I look at this particular tree, I see this particular tree, I'm going to treat it differently still. And it's the same with fish. If when I look at salmon, I see dollar bills, I'm going to treat them one way. If when I look at salmon, I see salmon, I'm going to treat them another way. If when I look at this particular fish, I see this particular fish, I'll treat it differently still. The same is true also of women. If when I look at women, I see orifices, I'm going to treat them one way. If when I look at women, I see women, I'm going to treat them another way. And if when I look at this particular woman, I see this particular woman, I'm going to treat her differently still. If you perceive another as a resource, you're going to use them as opposed to enter into a relationship with them. And I need to be really clear that just because I perceive a fish as a fish, that doesn't mean that I can't eat it. And I was doing a radio interview in Spokane, Washington several years ago, and the interviewer said, you know, Indians exploited salmon too. And I said, no, they didn't, they ate them. And he said, what's the difference? I said, well, they gave them respect for the spirit in exchange for the flesh. And I knew that that answer was kind of bullshit, but I'm a male, and so I'm required by law to answer every question that's asked of me. And so that afternoon I went out and I sat next to this tree that I had a long relationship with, and I asked the tree, what is the fundamental predator-prey relationship? And the tree gave me the answer right away, which is, if you consume the flesh of another, you now take responsibility for the continuation of the other's community. So if I consume the flesh of salmon from the Klamath River, I now take responsibility for the continuation of the Klamath River salmon. And that's, everybody knows this. You know, bears know it, mergansers know it, newts know it. The mergansers know that if you consume all the newts in this pond, there won't be any newts in the pond anymore. And
so I don't necessarily agree that these other animals know that. I just think that their species has developed a natural equilibrium with that. If the population of mergansers gets out of hand, then it's going to eat all the newts out of that pond, and then it's going to die off, right? And I think that that would have been a better way to illustrate his point here than to say that they have some knowledge of balance. They don't. They're consumption machines just like we are. And if their population outstrips the newt supply, then there's going to be no more newts, and then there's going to be no more mergansers in that area. So, and I really don't think it strips anything from his argument, but I think it reveals his, you know, his very, very eco-centric green way of looking at things, right? Which I don't necessarily share. I don't necessarily disagree with either. I don't think it's a harmful way of looking at things, but he definitely anthropomorphizes natural things in a way that is a little unsettling in his argument. This is why keeping the population stupid is an imperative. If the common man saw the reality of what most corporations are doing to the world, they would know to boycott those who use cruel practices. I mean, I don't think they would, dude. I think the common man does know that corporations fucking suck. Because you know what, dude? I never say, man, fucking corporations suck to anybody and have them go, nuh-uh, they're great. I never had that conversation. Man, I love fucking corporations, man. They're great. No. I think everybody knows that corporations are evil. I just think we like our Pepsi more than we like, you know, taking care of the indigenous people that make the bottles or whatever the fuck. I think we like our Nikes more than we like the fucking Puerto Rican kid that sewed them together. That's the truth about humanity. Yeah, they wouldn't boycott a goddamn thing. I gotta agree with Jay. Let's let's let Derek go on here.
We just forget sometimes. And that's the fundamental predator-prey bargain that we have to get into. And I want to say something else about that, and then we'll come back to the other. But I got into a big argument with this guy several years ago because he was saying that because I use toilet paper that I am just as culpable for deforestation as the CEO of Weyerhaeuser. And I knew that that was wrong, but I couldn't really articulate why. And he said, go ask a tree. A tree will tell you. So I went out and asked a tree, and the tree said, you're an animal. You consume things. Get over it. But then it also gave me the other answer, which is yes, I am culpable, not because I consume the flesh of a tree. I'm culpable because I consume the flesh of a tree without fulfilling my end of the bargain. I'm culpable not because I use toilet paper, but because I don't stop Weyerhaeuser from deforesting. And that's a much more serious culpability than simply consuming. So I'm not culpable because I consume Klamath River salmon. I'm culpable because I consume Klamath River salmon and I don't take out the fucking Iron Gate. Thanks.
So he's actually talking about eco-terrorism here, which let's all take a moment to discuss that. When he says take out the Iron Gate, he's talking about an Iron Gate that was installed in the Klamath River that interferes with salmon spawning, but fulfills some purpose for the society. He's talking about blowing it up. I mean, he's talking about, if he consumes fish from the Klamath River, then he has some culpability to make sure that the fish from the Klamath River remain strong so that he can continue to feed from them. That's his end of the bargain. And I don't disagree with that. I disagree that other animals would ever have a sense of that equilibrium. I think that equilibrium comes naturally with die-offs and shit. But we're not like other animals. We can consider the consequences of our action. And I don't disagree with him that if you're going to take something natural and use it to further your society, and in fact make it a staple of your society, then it is incumbent upon you to replace what you take. Or at least see to the regrowth of what you take. You see? Do I agree that we should go blow up dams and stuff? No. I'm not an eco-terrorist. Derek Jensen might be. And a lot of people right here, this is kind of the sad thing about, closed-mindedness, is a lot of people right here would tune out. They'd say, oh, he's a fucking crazy leftist, loon, tree hugger. He's talking about having fucking conversations with trees. He's talking about blowing up dams. What a fucking loon. And they'd stop listening to his argument right here. And that's a shame, because you don't have to agree with all of his premises to take things away from this argument, Eco-terrorism could be justified, but almost never makes an impact on anything whatsoever. So at that point, why do it? I mean, you make a point. Eco-terrorism might bring more attention to the problems of the world, but it'll make people more willingly ignorant, if anything. I mean, it'll make people angry at the people who are trying to bring, and that doesn't engender a whole lot of positivity for your topic when you're blowing shit up all over town. It makes people scared, and that's, Derek Jensen is at the point where he feels like that's what needs to happen. He feels like people need to be scared. He feels like people deserve to be scared. I mean, when he looks at that population that would be unsettled if he set off some bombs and blew up some dams, he thinks that they deserve that because they're consumers that are not fulfilling their end of the bargain. They're not putting back what they take. And that is contributing to the downfall of humanity. And I don't disagree with him. I just disagree with his methods in stopping it. I don't think that blowing up a dam or all dams is going to stop what's happening.
Okay, second premise is that...
Okay, hold on. Before he gets to his second premise, let's have a general discussion of his defense of his first premise. It ends a little wonky with his call to eco-terrorism. Isn't him talking to trees just putting himself in the position of the tree? Yes. It is, once again, more anthropomorphizing of the tree. It is extrapolating the will of something that has no will, right? A tree doesn't tell humans anything about chopping it down and using it. A tree doesn't have any advice for human beings, right? This is all spiritualism, which is woven into his philosophy and is one of the things that I take issue with Derek Jensen on. But I don't think it lessens the weight of the other points that he's made so far. And those, I think, are the ones that are up for discussion. So, the first premise being that civilization is not and cannot be sustainable. And he defended that position by talking about our way of life being unsustainable due to the requirement of importation of resources, and that also establishes a hierarchy of violence, which he'll talk about a lot more over the premises. We'll hear more about it. But that establishes a hierarchy of violence over society where there's an implicit, kind of promise from these big cities that if we can't get what we need, we're going to take. I don't necessarily disagree with any of those premises. Interesting too. Well, the sun is sustainable in terms of that it's a natural occurrence that has a natural time clock, right? Right. It's everything is finite. So, we could just get lost in pedantic, argument here, or we can actually talk about reality. Yeah, if somebody in here's trolling and just being a fucking douchebag, feel free to dunk him, dude. Like, honestly, like, if he's just if he's disagreeing, that's one thing because I want to hear that. But if he's just calling people pretentious and not fucking offering any fucking counter argument, then just kick his fucking faggoty ass because that's not what we're here to do. Unfortunately, hard to take a man like this seriously. It's a shame, yeah, but you can't listen to everyone. And if someone espouses shit like yin yang bears, then they're prime candidate. Yeah, I can understand how you feel that way. I just think it's a shame, because I think the man is not only really intelligent but really correct on a lot of things, and because he has some wonky thoughts and some spiritualistic belief and some fundamental misunderstandings of animal, you know, will doesn't mean that he's not right when it comes to his broader premises. I just mean if you're talking about sustainability, you need to decide what time scale you're looking on. Maybe our civilization is sustainable, i.e., can exist for 200 years as it is, but not more. Well, he talked about that earlier, though. He had a conversation with a friend, and he asked that friend, "What time do you think would be the best time to live in?" And he said, "The Stone Age, because it's the only time that was ever sustainable for humanity." And that not only that, but we'll be there again. And the only question is what'll be left of the world for those people who are put back there. So I had a little lag spike there. What'll be left for the people who were put back to the Stone Age. So we've been there before. It was the only time that humanity lives sustainably. I agree with that. We'll be back there again someday. I also agree with that. What'll be left of the world for those people? Well, what of those people? What are they going to have to cobble together a life with? That's really the question here, right? He has a good point, but his premise is flawed. He sees the dynamic as good use versus bad use of a resource, when really all use on a scale that moves from sustainable to self-destructive. Sure. I don't think that he's necessarily ruled that out. When we're talking about unsustainable resources, like oil, right? That's the resource that he used as an example, right? That's not sustainable. There's no amount of use of oil that is sustainable because it's a finite resource. We can't put back what we take. Trees are another thing. We can replant, we can selectively harvest trees, but it would require us to change the way that we use paper. So is that going to happen? No. A village level use of resources is the same as a mega city, just on a smaller scale. That's absolutely not true. If you have a village sitting on the Klamath River of Indians, about 100 individuals, right? They're going to be able to fish that river every fucking year, and the river's just going to be fucking full of fish every year. They're, you know what I mean? They're not taking more than nature replaces. As that village grows, you get 10,000 people in there, they're going to fucking eat that river dry every year. And less salmon are going to come back every year because less of them are going to make it upriver when they spawn. And, you know what I mean? That just doesn't make any sense. I totally disagree with you. There is a level of humans living together that is totally sustainable. And city doesn't, it can't be a city. A city is outside of that sphere, in my mind, and I think defensively. What if there are a lot of villages along that river? Well, then you're talking about a society, right? You're talking more like a civilization. You have to start looking at them as part of the same whole. And that's really not how these Indian societies worked, at least not in the area that he's talking about. It's all about short-term gains with no care for long-term effects. Take as much as you can, as soon as you can, make as much money off it as you can. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the argument here, right? I think as a species, we have no choice. His arguments are fundamentally flawed because of the fact that it's in our instinct. Yeah, but we're a species that understands instinct. We're a species that can consider the repercussions of our actions in a way that other species can't. So we can't look at ourselves like we're completely blameless in this and it's just we're forced to waste trees by wiping our asses with them. That's a bullshit excuse that gives man an out that he doesn't deserve. The long run for any species is millions of years. Does humanity as a species feel like we're going to be around till the end of the universe? If there is an end, we've had a good run. Well, I mean, I think what Derek Jensen is talking about here is extending our reach as far as we can, in terms of living here sustainably on this planet for as long as we can before the universe decides to recycle our fucking solar system, which it inevitably will, before our sun dies, which it inevitably will. That river is the means of importing the salmon. No, a road is not the means of a banana getting to your mouth. The salmon live in the river. It's not a means of importation. They're not taking that salmon from somewhere else and bringing it to their city from outside of that sphere. The salmon are a natural part of the land that they live on. They're a natural. That's really dumb, man. Come on, you got to think a little bit. No. A river is not a method of importation unless you put a boat on it. Yeah, if you grow corn in your yard, you're not importing the corn, yeah. You're not importing the corn when you go pick it off of your corn stalks in your yard and bring it into the house. The little footpath that you use from your corn stalks to your house is not a method of importation. Anyway, I think we're ready to move on to the second premise here, so let's do it.
Traditional communities do not often voluntarily give up or sell the resources on which their communities are based until their communities have been destroyed. They also do not willingly allow their land bases to be damaged so that other resources, gold, oil, and so on, can be extracted. It follows that those who want the resources will do what they can to destroy traditional communities, as we see. Third premise.
So that second premise, he doesn't really spend much time defending. And I don't really think it needs much defending. He's talking about smaller traditional communities being defensive of the land base that they live on for good reason, because it sustains their existence. And that if they happen to live on a resource that some larger superpower needs, that superpower is going to find a way to destroy that traditional community and take what it wants. And that is defensible, I think, historically over and over and over and over and over again, which is why I don't think he spends much time defending it. I think I mean, I don't know. I guess I'll pause here for a second and ask, does anybody disagree with that premise? History speaks for itself, sure. I mean, I really don't expect a whole lot of disagreement, but, if anybody has, you know, a point here, I'll hear it. You don't even know what's going on? Then shut the fuck up, Puddles. If we lived a thousands, if we live, well, hold on. If we lived thousands of years rather than less than 100, we'd probably have a better grasp of how our resources. Yeah, I mean that is a problem, right? Our our shorter lifespans tend to make us either less cognizant or less careful with things because really we all kind of know it's not my problem. Like, I'm not going to eat the last salmon out of the Klamath River, so I'm just going to keep eating salmon. Somebody eventually is going to have to go like, oh shit, there's no more salmon in the Klamath River. But yeah, no, that's true. See, but the only reason, like, here's what you're saying. Here's the problem. The only You're talking about multiple communities along the river and sharing of corn, right? So let's say that there were multiple Indian communities along this river, and they would be sharing their corn resources, right? If they're doing that, then you have to start looking at them as bigger than what they are. Those societies wouldn't need to get corn from the next village over because they grow all the corn they need on the land that they live on, right? So that type of trade just isn't necessary and doesn't really come into play until you start talking about more modern civilization, where it's like, oh, you've got corn and we don't want to spend our money making corn. We want to grow squash. So let's give us your corn and we'll give you a few squashes and some buffalo hides. That then you're starting to talk about the exploitation of somebody else's resource. But once again, those are just luxuries. None of these Indian villages required any of the other ones to operate. They were all living off the land. They all lived, ate what they lived on. So, you can't call a river a method of importation. It just doesn't matter. That's a function of population size, but it's the same dynamic of usage. Right. No, it isn't. I mean, if you listen to his premise, like, I'm not going to waste a whole lot of time on this because I found pretty much everything you've said to be like pretty much misunderstanding what we're talking about here. But if you listen to his premise, a city is any collection of people that is too large to sustain itself on its own land base. A city requires the importation of resources. None of the Indian villages on the Klamath River, like we're talking about, met that criteria. So, and calling a river a method of importation is just silly. All right, we're going to move on to third premise.
Our way of living, industrial civilization, is based on, requires, and will collapse very quickly without persistent and widespread violence. I gave a talk a few years ago in Eugene, and afterwards this guy raised his hand and he said, you talk about how violent this culture is, and I just don't see it. There's no violence in my life. I'm not violent myself. I don't see any violence. And it's significant to this story, by the way, that it was a man who said it, not a woman. And I said, okay, where's your shirt made? And he looked and it was made in Bangladesh. And I said, do we even need to talk about that? He's like, no. I said,
So, this is a really big point. He's beginning to get to the meat of how his argument kind of knocked on my door philosophically and changed the way that I think. This premise is a tough one, right? Is society sustainable without persistent ongoing violence? Right? Let's let him defend a little more before we get into it.
said, okay. And also, I'm just wondering, do you pay rent? He's like, yeah. I said, why? He said, because I don't own? I said, no, what would happen if you didn't pay rent? He said, well, I get evicted. I said, what does that mean? I don't understand. What happens when you get evicted? And he said, well, a sheriff would come to my house, and he would... I said, stop right there. What happens if the sheriff comes to your house, and you say, hey, I was just getting done cooking dinner. Come on in. Have some food. So the sheriff comes in, sits down, and you cook him dinner, and you feed him, and you don't poison him. And then after dinner, you say to him, you know, it's been nice having you here, but your company's not all that pleasant, so I would like for you to leave my home now. What would happen? He said, well, the sheriff would take out his gun, and he'd say, I'm here to evict you. You got to leave, because you didn't pay your rent. I said, so the reason you pay rent is because if you don't, some guy is going to come to your house with a gun, and he's going to kick you out of your home. He's like, I guess. And I said, okay, let's try it again. What happens if you're really hungry, and so you go to the grocery store, lots of food there, you know, and you just start eating? What's going to happen? So we're going to call the sheriff, and he's going to come. He's the same guy. He's a real asshole, isn't he? The sheriff's going to come and take you away. So what this means is that in order for you to survive, in order for you to have a place to sleep, a place to be, you have to pay somebody. And in order to eat, you have to pay somebody.
So, what do you think? I think that this is defensible all the way down the line for 99.99% of humanity. Life is not sustainable without persistent ongoing violence. The very act of existing is depriving another life form of the resource you consume. But he already talked about that earlier. He talked about that because, look, he allows for the fact that we're biological entities that have to eat other entities. We're omnivorous creatures. We eat fish, we eat beef, we eat chicken. He was talking about the duty, if that's a staple of your diet, the duty to protect that. Right? And then he's talking about the juxtaposition of violence in our society with our inability to protect those things that we use, right? So this is all Derek Jensen telling you why we're fucked. I mean, yeah, sure. And the fish is eating, you know, those salmon that you're eating are predatory fish. They're eating other little fish, you know? We're not them. We're not a salmon. Well, he's correct. That's why we need socialized basic stuff, basic housing. Exactly, right? But still, the point he makes here, in my mind, stands, right? In order to exist, in order to have shelter from the elements, which you need to live, in order to have food in your mouth, which you need to live, you have to pay somebody or beg somebody for it, or rely on the charity of another person for it. If you can't pay, you better hope somebody's willing to give you. And if they're not, you live in a dumpster till you die. Right? Anarcho-primitivists' real end game is having at most 500 million people on Earth literally living in the Stone Age. I understand that. I honestly understand that. I'm not here to defend Derek Jensen's anarcho-primitivism. In fact, I've been very critical of it the whole night as we've been watching this. Anyway, we're going to move on here.
That's really weird. And if you don't, somebody with a gun is going to come and do something bad to you. So part of the reason that a lot of us don't see the violence is because, well, part of the reason is a different subject. Part of the reason is because a lot of the violence is exported. I was doing a talk in Massachusetts a few years ago, and somebody said to me afterwards, you know, we now are living way more sustainably than they did 100 years ago. And I said, how do you know that? They said, because there's a lot more trees here in Massachusetts than there were 100 years ago. I said, yeah, it's because you're getting all your wood from South America. And so a lot of the violence is simply exported. And then the other part of it is a lot of us don't perceive this violence because we've been so metabolized into the system and we so accept its premises that there's no need to do violence to us because we're standing straight in line. But of course, if we step out the tiniest bit, got to watch out. Oh, but we're not going to do that. Okay, now we go to the fourth premise.
All right. So I think it's important for us to have a quick discussion of this third premise here. That constant and persistent violence is necessary to sustain our way of life. I'm going to see if I can pull up his premises here so I can read them. I'll just pull this over here and yeah, okay. He's got it on his website here, so I can I'm just going to pull this over so that I can read it as I need to. I can pull it up when I need it. What year is this speech from? I'm not 100% sure. Is this... I think it's from the early 2000s. So, his third premise is, our way of living, industrial civilization, is based on, requires, and would collapse very quickly without persistent and widespread violence. So, agreements and disagreements with that. It's necessary in our current framework, but may not be necessary in a resource-based economy. But isn't a resource-based economy addressed by the first premise that we all agreed with, which is the culture will not voluntarily transfer to a sustainable and sane way of living, right? Premise number one, civilization is not and can never be sustainable. This is especially true for industrial civilization. So, why does he say violence and not police force? Because police brutality is just one form of violence, and only really one form of the societal violence that he's talking about. Where he's talking about military force, he's talking about social hierarchies, he's talking about everything. He just used the police force as one example of the type of violence he's talking about. And he also touched on, and will touch on again, the exportation of that violence, making it less visible. So while you may live a life which you feel is free from violence, it isn't, because of the reasons he listed. If you needed to eat and didn't have money and ate, you would be subject to violence. If you couldn't pay the rent on your apartment or couldn't pay the mortgage on your house, you'd be subject to violence. But even outside of that, you live in a culture, your tax dollars, your citizenship supports a system that exports violence all over the world. Economic violence, military violence, for the securing of resources, basically. Violence is a part of nature. Deal with it. I mean, I'm fine with that. I'm not denying that violence is a part of nature. And I'm not denying that violence is a part of civilization, and neither is Derek Jensen. He's just making a point about it. I'm asking, if you don't disagree with the premise, that's fine. A village will pillage from another village if they want what they have. If humanity was capable of fully sharing, then there would be no war. Well, maybe you're true. Maybe that's right. I don't really. Whoa, buddy. Why you do that? Okay. Just somehow fucking minimized everything on my desktop. Okay. There we go. Oh wait, that's Twitch. What happened to the chat? Where the chat at? There we go. All right. We back. Let's keep going.
This culture, civilization, this I think might be my favorite premise of the book, is based on a clearly defined and widely accepted, yet often unarticulated hierarchy. Violence done by those higher on the hierarchy to those lower is nearly always transparent, invisible, it's unnoticed. When it is noticed, it's fully rationalized. Violence done by those lower on the hierarchy to those higher is unthinkable. And when it does happen, it's met with shock, horror, and the fetishization of the victims. And there's so many examples of this. One example is that within my own family when I was a kid, my father was extremely violent, and so the violence flowed constantly downhill. And the one time that my brother ever fought back, he got beaten far worse than any other time because, of course, he had committed blasphemy by sending violence up the hierarchy. That's one example. Another example is, I live where there's tons of bears near where I live, and I just love seeing them. Oh, it's so cool. A mother and baby bear actually fell asleep outside my mom's house the other day. And so cool, I was thinking about that afterwards. How many wild animals have I ever seen asleep? And, well, 2 bears. Maybe some grasshoppers, it's hard to tell. Anyway, but people, and I walk through the forest all the time. I walk through forest at night with no lantern and all this stuff. And the Fed's going, he walks through the forest at night with no lantern. You can use that. Anyway, so I walk through the forest. I'm scared of the Feds, frankly, not the bears. Anyway, so I walk through the forest at night, and people go, oh my God, aren't you scared of the bears? I mean, they could attack or something. And I know that there is 1 person dies in North America every other year from bear attacks. And 46,000 Americans die every year because of automobile crashes. So we're scared of the wrong thing. I mean, we should walk through a parking lot and it's like, oh my God, the cars are all going. Anyway, if you don't believe me about the violence is only allowed to flow one direction with that, the next time there's one of those, like the next time there's a big protest or something, maybe anti-war or anti-so-called free trade, whatever, just do an experiment, which is take a baseball bat and then just walk up to one of the policemen and say, excuse me, Officer Friendly, nothing personal, I'm just conducting an experiment. And hit him, and then hit him a couple more times real fast. And then, somebody's going to take down your name. Okay, so anyway, and then I'll talk to you in about 50 years. Because you've committed blasphemy, you've sent violence up the hierarchy. Oh, and then I want to say one more thing about this, which is that and this is going to have to, does anybody mind if I swear? I think that the word fuck is the most amazing word in the English language because it's all of patriarchy condensed into 4 letters.
So here's another tune-out point for a lot of people. They're like, oh my God, did he just say patriarchy? Yes, he's kind of a feminist. Although you won't hear a lot of the social justice whining out of him that you'll hear out of modern social justice warriors. He does share some of their foundational beliefs, yeah. So let's listen to why fuck is all of patriarchy condensed into 4 letters.
Because the same word that means make love to means do great violence to. That's really, really twisted. And it's also kind of confusing. I mean, because somebody can say to me, like, I'm going to fuck you. And I'm like, I need more information. I mean, even within the context of a loving heterosexual relationship, this shows how deeply the objectification of women, how deep the objectification of women goes within this culture and within our language, is even within the context of a loving heterosexual relationship, it's really hard to not have the woman get objectified. So the man says to the woman, I would like to be inside of you. You know what just happened? She's the object of the sentence. Okay, on the other hand, the woman says to the man, I would like for you to be inside me. You know what? She's still the object of the sentence. So the man says to the woman, I would like for you to be around me. And she's like, I'm sorry, can you speak English? I don't know what you want.
When does he dye his hair pink? Yeah. He's conflating a colloquial term with the original definition. He definitely is. I mean, she is the proper subject of both of those sentences. I want to be inside you. You are the subject, right? I want you to be inside me. She is the subject of the sentence. She's the end result in both. I mean, that is at least grammatically proper. Now, does that confer some sort of hierarchy, like patriarchal hierarchy in society? Not necessarily. I think it is indicative of the male domination of society that we say, I want to be inside you rather than I would like to have you around me. you know? I mean, it's probably, you're right, Curly Q. It's probably also due to our anatomy. It makes more sense to say, I want to stick this in you than it does to say, I want to have you around this. But whatever. Like I said, Derek Jensen has his flaws. This is, I think, one of them. I think this is a distraction from the point, which once again, let's check in on this real quick. The point we're talking about is civilization is based on a clearly defined and widely accepted yet often unarticulated hierarchy. Violence done by those higher on the hierarchy to those lower is nearly always invisible, that is, unnoticed. When it is noticed, it's fully rationalized. Violence done by those lower on the hierarchy to those higher is unthinkable, and when it does occur, it's regarded with shock, horror, and the fetishization of the victims. I think that he should have spent his time providing real-world examples of that, which there are many. Than digressing into this kind of feminist diatribe here. Yeah, I would like to ride
okay
you.
For homosexuals to be in the military as long as you don't talk about it. I guess you can do whatever you want, you just can't talk. Anyway, but which, by the way, I have to say, full disclosure here, I have to say that I actually agree that homosexuals should not be allowed in the military. I feel very strongly, actually, that homosexuals should not be allowed in the military. But that probably doesn't mean as much as it could, because I also think that heterosexuals, asexuals, the transgendered, bisexuals should not be allowed in the military either. Fifth premise. The property of those higher on the hierarchy is more valuable than the lives of those below. It is acceptable for those above to increase the amount of property they control, in everyday language to make money, by destroying or taking the lives of those below. This is called production. If those below damage the property of those above may kill or otherwise destroy the lives of those below. This is called justice.
So, I mean, let's let him defend the premise before we talk about
it. Sixth premise.
He doesn't. Okay. So this is a tough one. Let's read it again, because this one is a little harder pill for me to swallow, honestly. It's where his ideology goes a little off the rails, or at least starts to for me. The property of those higher on the hierarchy is more valuable than the lives of those below. I don't necessarily disagree at this point. It is acceptable for those above to increase the amount of property they control, in everyday language, to make money, by destroying or taking the lives of those below. I also don't disagree. So up to this point, we're on the same page. I'm agreeing with him up till this point in premise 5. This is called production. Well, do I disagree with this? In corporate parlance, an aspect of production is often the destruction of the lives and property of those below the corporation and the hierarchy. It's often part of that. Is it always part of that? I don't think so. This, I think, is a flaw. I think trying to take the word production and have it mean this ignores other ways that corporations could produce. Now, he might argue against that by saying that those corporations use products that are made by other corporations or made by the same corporations that would fit this descriptor. And maybe he's right about that. But this seems to be slightly problematic. If those below damage the property above, those above may kill or otherwise destroy the lives of those below. This is called justice. Well, I'm sure Derek Jensen would appreciate someone being brought to justice for some crime. Now, once again, I don't know the man personally. I know his ideology pretty well. And I don't think that there's anything in his ideology that says that he wouldn't like to be protected if somebody came for his stuff. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe he would rather the police not exist. But there was a sense of justice in the Indian societies and the Stone Age societies that he, kind of extols the virtues of. And it was a lot more imperfect than our sense of justice. There was a lot less direct path to true justice for a caveman than there is for a man living in the United States of America. So, if a person breaks into a rich person's house and that person is thrown in jail or killed, is that rich person wrong for defending that property in that way? In Derek Jensen's mind, the answer to that is yes. And I think that that is because he sees the culpability of that rich person being higher up on that hierarchy, taking a larger piece of what isn't theirs, right? I don't know that I agree with that. Just saw an ad when coming back to the stream. Congrats. That's weird. Ads on every stream. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where you need a certain threshold of capital in order to produce modern goods, i.e. factories. Right. That's absolutely true. The idea we call it justice is nonsense, though. Who calls the Iraq War justice? Some people did. Who's to say that it isn't potentially possible to create the perfect import-free system with adequate technology? I mean, who's to say we're going to reach that before this world is a burnt-out cinder that can't support us anymore? I mean, I think that's kind of the point. The time for that kind of technology was about 20 years ago. It didn't happen, and we're fucked now. Let's go ahead and move on and let him start talking about his sixth premise here.
Is the one that I sort of alluded to early on. This culture is not redeemable. The culture won't undergo any sort of voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living. If we don't put a halt to it, civilization, this culture, will continue to immiserate the vast majority of humans and to degrade the planet until it, civilization, and probably the planet, collapses. The effects of this degradation will continue to harm humans and non-humans for a very long time. Seventh premise. The longer we wait for civilization to crash, or the longer we wait before we ourselves bring it down, the messier will be the crash, and the worse things will be for those humans and non-humans who live during it and for those who come after. If somebody would have brought down civilization, whatever that means, 200 years ago, if Tecumseh would have won, then people in the East would still be able to eat passenger pigeons. I mean, never minding passenger pigeons' beautiful existence for themselves. If somebody would have brought down civilization 100 years ago, people in this region, through the crash, would still be able to eat salmon. There's going to be people sitting along the banks of the Columbia 50 years from now, and, well, they'll be glowing, for one thing, because of Hanford, and they'll also be starving to death, and they'll be saying, I'm starving to death because you allowed the dams to stand. God damn you. And
so, a little more eco-terrorism creeping back into his rhetoric here. It's funny how this sort of thing is allowed to be up for years and years on YouTube, and this is really the kind of thing that they talk about being most against. I'm not really calling for this to be removed. I just think it's interesting that YouTube doesn't see a need to remove this, when it has taken such a strong stance against terroristic threats and stuff. We don't have enough information to extrapolate what would happen when a civilization collapses or how messy it would be and the relation between complexity and degradation. Right. We can't know for sure. We can, however, extrapolate some things about our actions that are going to make it harder for those that come after our civilization. The more we degrade the land base, the harder time the civilization that comes after us is going to have getting a foothold on that land base and dealing with the damage that we've done. So I think that that's a defensible statement. I don't have a problem with that statement as it stands, and I think that's what he was saying. He's saying that there's no way for us to know exactly what life is going to be like for the people that follow this civilization, because we don't know exactly what that fall is going to look like and what shape it's going to take. But we do know that the more damage we do now, the more damage those people who are already in a weakened state from having society collapse around them are going to have to deal with, the more adversity and the more struggle that they're going to have to deal with. I think that that's 100% defensibly true. Why get rid of talk of terrorism when they're busy knocking weed? Yeah, so stupid. Again, this guy is wrapping his self-interest in an eco-idealism and ignoring that the human organism is doing what every other organism does. I mean, you've been harping on that same note. I understand that you have a fundamental disagreement with him trying to classify human beings as different from other organisms. I don't. I think that human beings are different from other organisms. I think our consciousness puts us in a different... We can consider the consequences of our actions in a way that no other organism on the planet can. So I think that trying to pretend that we're just some biological organism that's incapable of considering its actions and considering its own future is just selling us short as a species. And I think it really, even beyond selling us short, I think it offers people like you an excuse to be blithely ignorant and stupid to the consumption and the problem that's going on. Yeah, man, humans are just doing what humans do, man. We're just animals, bro. Animals eat everything in sight, man. It's our biological imperative. And man, whatever. If that's your worldview, if that's how you look at humanity, if that's what you got to do to put your head on the fucking pillow and get rest at night, then all power to you, bro. But you ain't selling that up this river. I ain't buying it up here. Human beings don't get a pass for their stupidity just because they're animals. We've got the ability to consider this shit in a way that an animal doesn't. And we have a culpability to consider this shit in a way that animals don't. Yeah. Yeah, we're just being humans, man. We dump all this fucking radioactive sludge all over the fucking, ground, and it seeps into the groundwater, man. We're just doing what humans do, bro. All right. That's fine, man. Your point has been noticed. We are ascended. We have the unprecedented conscience power to misunderstand Civil War and pre-Columbian history. Well, okay. Wow, man. Wowsy, 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 woo-woo. We're only as smart as we act. The double-edged sword of our intelligence. It allows us to create these amazing means of production that also destroy us. But we also have the power to mitigate its negative effects if we dare. We have the power to, but we don't have the will or the intention to, which is kind of the point of this talk, I think. Rather than getting mired down in this like, oh man, human beings are just gonna nuke each other anyway, bro. Which may or may not be true. I just think it's a lazy philosophical point to try and keep making. You are rarely this wrong. But what can you and I really do? Well, we can talk about it. I mean, look, you've heard my philosophy. You know my pessimistic bent. You know that I know that we're not going to do anything about this, but it's an interesting exercise to examine. I like having these talks with you guys. I like having this argument. But even if we return to the Stone Age, then it's just likely to repeat again, where we build our tech and then crash the ecosystem again. I mean, you're absolutely right, but I guess the hope here is that we learn something, right? We've learned things from civilizations that have risen to power and fallen before ours. We've taken pieces of their civilization and learned lessons from what they did. Maybe if that cycle happens enough times, humanity will eventually reach some sort of equilibrium with its environment. I mean, it's a very utopian thought, but we're talking about the far future here. Anything's possible, right? Nobody's got a fucking crystal ball. Paul, remember his experiment with the baseball bat? Don't you think in a village by the river, if you were to walk up to someone and hit them with a bat, you'd at least be reprimanded? Oh, absolutely. I mean, that person would probably pick up a stick and hit you back with it. That's not the point he was making. He was talking about how it's perfectly okay in a protest situation for a cop to use a billy club to swat somebody over the head, even if they had put that cop into no physical danger. But if you do the same thing to a cop and go up with a billy club and swat that cop over the head, you're going to jail for 50 fucking years. So that cop, because he's higher up on the hierarchy to you, that's just part of his job. Part of his job is standing behind his riot shield and swatting hippies over the head at a protest. So no repercussions for him. He gets to go home and have a coffee and fuck his fat wife and, go to work the next day and fuck his mistress on his lunch break. And you know what I mean? He gets to go on with his fucking life like nothing happened after he swatted you and your friends over the head at a protest. But if you walk up to him and do the same thing and swat him over the head, it's not your job. That's not your job. That's not your position on the hierarchy. It's his position to do violence to you, not you to him. So the repercussion is very different. But the act is the same. He swatted you with a billy club a few times and got nothing for it. You swatted him with a billy club a few times and got life in prison. This is at least a great talk. Hopefully info can be passed down. However, I doubt things will change. Well, so does he. So let's see. Let's take a look at the premise just real quick one last time before we move on, because I think he didn't spend a whole... Well, shit. Oh, no, it's up here now. Yeah. So he just said, civilization's not redeemable. This culture will not undergo any sort of voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living. If we do not put a halt to it, civilization will continue to immiserate the vast majority of humans and to degrade the planet until civilization, and probably the planet, collapses. The effect of this degradation will continue to harm humans and non-humans for a very long time. I don't disagree with premise 6 at all. In fact, premise 6 was basically established before he started this talk. So premise 6, I don't disagree with at all. I think is defensible and true. I guess I'll give everybody a couple of seconds if you got any final words on this before we move on to 7 and hear what he has to say about that. I don't know why I pulled that out again. I should just put it here. Population growing as fast as it is will bring resource shortages even sooner, but almost every culture feels the need to breed like rabbits, and anyone who suggests a control measure is called an asshole. Yeah, or a psycho, or a eugenicist, or whatever other buzzword they use to discount what you're talking about. Let's move on to premise 7, shall we?
But the dams are really important. They're necessary for the electricity to make it so Safeco Field you can move the top back and forth. They're necessary to smelt aluminum for beer cans. Anyway, so the longer we wait, I mean, if somebody would have brought down civilization 100 years ago, we wouldn't have to worry much about global warming, and we wouldn't have to worry about the toxification of the total environment with pesticides. We wouldn't have to worry about dioxin in every mother's breast milk. I mean, if 50 and 75 years from now, are people going to be going, if somebody would have brought it down 75 years ago, we'd still have amphibians. If somebody would have brought it down 75 years ago, we would still have, well, somebody would have brought it down 15 years ago. They'll be saying 15 years from now, we'd still have sturgeon. It's like, how long? At what point? What's the threshold? 100 years from now, it's like we'd still have, name it. we'd still have oceans, air to breathe. You know, that's not one of my premises, but that's something that if I would have thought of it when I was writing the book would have been one of the premises, which is the primary, if not only measure by which we'll be judged by those who come after is going to be the health of the land base. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we voted Democrat, Republican, Green, anarchist, didn't vote at all. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we recycled. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we were violent or nonviolent. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we're nice people or not nice people. They're not going to give a shit as to whether we wrote great books or made great films or did great talks or anything else. They're going to care about whether they can breathe the air and drink the water. You know, we can all fantasize whatever we want about some groovy eco-socialist utopia with free love everywhere. It doesn't fucking matter if you can't breathe the air and can't drink the water. And the only measure, I mean, it's embarrassing to say this, but the only measure by which any generation will be judged is the health of the land base that they pass on.
So, I don't know that I agree with this, and this isn't really a premise, this is just a little sub-point that he makes about how the only way that we're going to be judged is by the damage that we do or how we leave the land base for the people that come after us and after this civilization falls, right? I think that they will take note of our books. I think that they will take note of our movies and our achievements, and I think that they'll use those achievements to rebuild their society, whatever's left. So I think that this is a little short-sighted, but I do think that they will judge us very harshly for how we leave the planet, because in the first years of rebuilding, he's absolutely right. You know, in the first couple of generations of humanity after the fall, they really aren't going to care about our books or our movies or our internets or our trip to the moon. They're going to care about how fucked up the land is that they lived on. And maybe that's going to jumpstart a different type of thinking in them. I mean, of course we judge those that came before us by the culture that they left us. So to assume that eventually humanity isn't going to get to the point where it starts to consider those things and assimilate those things again is just ridiculous. But he is right. You know, the first couple of, lifespans, the first 3 or 4 generations of humanity after the big fall, they're not going to give a fuck about Humphrey Bogart. You know, they're not going to give a shit about Citizen Kane or War and Peace. They're going to care about how toxic everything is and how fucked up everything is. In a few generations will be nothing but old legends. I think we've left a mark here that might let us be a little bit more than old legends. But I think on a long enough time scale, I agree with you. Eventually we get mythologized, just like all these other previous civilizations have been mythologized by us, But I do think that we remain, like, look, we've gotten pretty good at preserving the cultural artifacts of these ancient civilizations, at least at this point. We haven't always been so good at it. But we've got so much out there. I mean, we're so widespread. Our population has increased so much in the last 200 years that it's just unfathomable that we won't leave behind enough artifacts for these people to have a really good idea what we were, what we did, where we stood. And human beings have shown a desire to catalog themselves and to learn from their own history, So we're making a lot of assumptions here based on a little sub-point, but I just think it's an interesting thing to talk about. I don't like where he carries it, but...
That brings us to the 8th premise of the book. The needs of the natural world are more important than the needs of the economic system. The needs of the natural world are more important than the needs of the economic system. I have just guaranteed I will never hold public office. Another way to put the 8th premise is, any economic or social system that doesn't benefit the natural communities on which it's based is unsustainable, immoral, and really stupid. Sustainability, morality, and intelligence, as well as justice, requires the dismantling of any such economic or social system, or at the very least disallowing it from damaging your land base. Okay, ninth premise.
That's a tough one. Let's go. Let me just pull it up here and let's read it. Premise 8. The needs of the natural world are more important than the needs of the economic system. It makes sense to me as a foundational part of his ideology, but I think that there's enough shakiness up until this point in his ideology to make this one questionable for me. I don't really. I mean, ultimately, if you're talking about the survival of our species and the ultimate impermanence of our civilization, the fact that it is obviously just, it's on a time scale and it'll eventually fall like all other civilizations that came before it, then maybe this is true, right? Maybe we need to start thinking like this in terms of or at least the people that follow us. Saying we and meaning people that are living now in this culture and the people that are follow us that'll be born into this culture. I don't mean them. I mean the people that come after us, right? I don't think premise 8, the more I think about it, the more I think that premise 8 might ring true just in a general sense. I mean, if you're going to sustain life, you have to have a land base to sustain it on. Human beings can't live on rocks and irradiated fields and animals that are either diseased or extinct. And that's what we're pushing the world towards. So, right. So 8 makes sense. I agree. This is why it's fun to examine this. Another way to put premise 8, any economic or social system that does not benefit the natural communities on which it is based is unsustainable, immoral, and stupid. Sustainability, morality, and intelligence, as well as justice, require a dismantling of any such economic or social system, or at the very least disallowing it from damaging your land base. So this is an addendum to premise 8 that justifies a lot of his eco-terroristic bent. And I don't know how I feel about this, honestly. If premise 8, which seems to me like people agreed with, is true, then would this like little kind of clarification of his premise not be true as well? If you're talking about the sustainability of the human race, would it not benefit us to tear down any economic, social system, any fucking government mandate that stands in the way of us healing the land base, right, and stopping damage? It's all too subjective. I mean, maybe. He even admits in the clarification that it has limits at the very least. Yeah, he did say that. When you harvest all the trees, your paper company will fail. You got a point. But because of the truth of that, do we have and if you harvest all the trees, the ecosystem fails, right? So knowing that that's probably going to happen, knowing that until there are no trees left, paper companies are going to continue cutting down trees, or until trees are so depleted that there's no way they can ever bounce back, paper companies are going to continue cutting down trees. Is it incumbent upon our society, if it wants to survive, to blow up the paper companies? To blow up the toilet paper manufacturers and the printer paper manufacturers and the newspapers? I'd say it would be more incumbent to stop. Yeah, but once again, you have to follow the premises, right? We've all kind of agreed that we're not going to do that. We've agreed that this culture is not going to voluntarily undertake any sort of substantive change. So the question is it incumbent upon people in this society that realize that to go blow things up? Right? And the answer is kind of uncomfortable because it's no, but it's also yes, right? You're probably going to have to go watch the rest of the stream if you want to know what's up, Brent. lumber and paper are sustainable. They are sustainable if they are harvested sustainably, but we don't do that. Some companies do that, but other companies, especially foreign companies, are not beholden to any kind of logging restrictions, and they just log indiscriminately. So, if there's no rule if not everybody is following it. There's no law that you can't murder if it doesn't apply across the board. There's no rule like, hey, we got to conserve and sustainably harvest these trees and replant as we go if, people aren't following it, if everyone isn't beholden to that rule. So, this gets a little into my globalist way of thinking, because I started thinking of solutions to these problems that didn't involve eco-terrorism. And the solutions that I came up with all involved having a single world government that could enforce mandates like, hey, if you're going to take trees, you're going to replant and you're going to harvest them sustainably so that you don't damage the land base. If we had a world government that could enforce that globally, then we could actually talk about making a law that would change the face of the earth and change the way that human beings use trees. All right, so we're going to move on. I'm going to get through 10 premises tonight, and then I'm going to end the stream, and we'll do the rest of his premises later. So let's get through 10 premises here.
Oh, the ninth premise is pretty interesting. Actually, I'm getting kind of cold. It's pretty interesting. I can bash almost anything I want, and people are cool with it. I can bash capitalism, that's fine. I can bash environmentalism, that's fine. I can bash anarcho-primitivism, that's fine. I can bash myself, that's fine. I can bash blah, 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 it's fine. But there's a few things that you cannot bash. For example, if I bash, oh my God, when I bash science, I can just feel the sphincters in the audience start to quiver. Or also, if I bash Buddhism, oh my God, it's like you have not lived until you've been chased down the street by a bunch of pacifists.
So this is actually funny because TJ has talked about the same thing. I always used to wonder if this is true, but hearing TJ talk about making that video that was critical of Buddhism and then having Buddhists send him death threats for months and months and months, it's just interesting to hear that parroted in somebody else.
Or another one that's really hard to talk about is population, and because if you mention that there are more humans on the planet than the planet can support, then people suddenly start to presume that you're actually anti-human, which doesn't really follow in my mind. Oh, this is great too. I got to tell you this. That they say there's no such thing as a stupid question. I got one the other day, and so I'm gonna tell everybody in the country. There's this. I sometimes do interviews on a radio station one county down in Humboldt County, county south of where I live, and there's this guy who hates me and hates what I say so much that every time I'm on there, he calls up, and I'm not sure. I think he attacks me, but I usually can't figure out what the hell he's saying. And one time I was saying that humans have exceeded carrying capacity, and carrying capacity is the number of any given species who could live in a particular place forever without harming it. So you could have an island that has a carrying capacity of 1,000 deer. 1,000 deer could live there forever. But if you put 10,000 deer there, they're going to eat too much of the vegetation, cause erosion, and lower the carrying capacity, make it so the place can only support 500 deer. Anyway, so I was saying that humans have exceeded carrying capacity. And he called up just sputtering, and he said, "How dare you say that humans have exceeded their capacity to care?" Which may or may not be the case, but that's a different question. Anyway, so the ninth premise is basically Although there will clearly someday be far fewer humans than there are at present, there are many ways this reduction in population could occur. Some of those ways would be characterized by extreme violence and privation. Nuclear Armageddon, for example, would certainly reduce both population and consumption, yet would do so horrifically. The same would be true for a continuation of overshoot followed by crash. Other ways would be characterized by less violence. And I don't know what is going to happen, obviously, but this much I do know, that if we don't approach these problems actively, if we don't talk about our predicament and what we're going to do about it, the violence will be almost undoubtedly be more severe, the privation more extreme. And I want to be really clear. Every cell in my body wants for us to have a voluntary transformation. Just like every cell in my body wants for, that must be the tow truck. Just like every cell in my body wants for people to approach the whole question of there being too many humans, and I'm going to talk more about population in a second. But anyway, every cell in my body wants for us to approach that just reasonably and rationally and intelligently. But of course, we all know what we're going to do is just continue on this freight train to hell until it continues to fly off the cliff. Okay, so anyway, having said that, I need to say, by the way, that I don't think that population is actually, yes, there are more humans than the planet can support, but I don't think the population is a primary problem. I think population is actually a tertiary problem. The reason I think population is secondary instead of primary is that I think consumption is way more important. Because actual numbers don't matter. There could be 100 gazillion people on the planet, and if they didn't eat, shit, or stand anywhere, it wouldn't matter. The important thing is how much damage you're causing or how much help you're doing. Imagine that also, that humans can actually benefit their land base. What a strange concept that is. Anyway, and that's really important because when I think about overpopulation, the first image that comes to mind is, honestly, is a little brown baby with a distended belly in a third world nation. First image that comes to mind. When I think of overconsumption, the first thing I think of is an American. And who causes more damage? So that's why I don't think the population is a primary problem, but a secondary problem. And the reason I don't think the population is a secondary problem, but is actually a tertiary problem, is because, are there any demographers in here? Good, I hate demographers. And the reason I hate demographers is because sometimes they talk about something called the natural rate of population growth, which is that if you have X number of people, then the population exponentially rises, blah, blah, blah. And it presumes that people breed like rabbits. And the truth is, I don't even think rabbits breed like rabbits. It presumes that people don't make rational family planning decisions based upon their personal and social circumstances. Once again, the Tala lived there for 12,500 years in relatively steady state. And part of the reason is because they had an intimate relationship with their land base, and they would perceive damage to the land base as damage. And if perhaps they start to have too many babies, well, let's cut back. And, you would think, let's just think about this. What happens if you have a culture where somebody writes a book, and in this book they tell people to go forth and multiply, and this book becomes a really big bestseller? That's going to affect family planning decisions. And also, I need to say this too, that there were, in native North America, there were about 250 different plants that were used as contraceptives and abortifactants by the women. And the decisions to use those were made by women. Bunch of fucking primitives. And yeah, imagine that. And I gotta tell you the story too, this is so cool, is back at one point, a bunch of male anthropologists went out, and anthropologists like exclusively male at one point, and a bunch of anthropologists went out and they were trying to find out what indigenous peoples would use for contraceptive. And they would go talk to the men, because of course the men are the only ones we're talking to, and they'd say, so how do you not make babies? And they're like, that is a really good question. And so a lot of the anthropologists were saying, indigenous people don't know where babies come from. And then when women started getting into anthropology, the women would go talk to the indigenous peoples, and they would talk to the women. and they would say, you know, how do you not get pregnant? And the woman would say, oh, you know, if you take this certain route when you're 16, then you're sterile for 5 years, and when then when you're 20, then you have to do this and this. And the men are like, really? I had no idea. Oh, I want to say one more thing about population, which is that you know, the whole thing about making a wall down in Mexico or down at the border of Mexico, and how we need to stop all those Mexicans from coming up and the Central Americans and the El Guatemalans and the Nicaragüens or whatever their names are. I have to say that I am actually strongly in favor of closing the border to Mexico on one condition, which is that if you close it to people, you close it to the movement of resources as well.
So I think I'll probably stop there, actually. We got through 9 premises. This is probably going to take us a while to chew through. So let me just once again pull up his 9th premise here so that we can all take a look at it. Although there will clearly someday be far fewer humans than there are at present, there are many ways in which this reduction in population could occur or be achieved depending on the passivity or activity in which we choose to approach this transformation. I don't disagree up to this point. Some of these ways could be characterized by extreme violence and privation. Nuclear Armageddon, for example, would reduce both population and consumption, yet do so horrifically. The same would be true for a continuation of overshoot followed by a crash. Other ways could be characterized by less violence. Given the current levels of violence by this culture against both humans and the natural world, however, it is not possible to speak of reductions in population and consumption that do not involve violence and privation, not because the reductions themselves would necessarily involve violence, but because violence and privation have become the default. Okay, so what is he saying here? So he's talking about different ways that there could be a population reduction. But he's owning up to the fact that given the current level of violence and the way that we seem to handle things in society right now, it's not possible to speak of reductions in population and consumption that do not involve violence and privation. Not because the reductions themselves would necessarily involve violence, but because violence and privation have become the default. So he's just saying that anything that we do now, unless it involves a total sea change, which we've already established it's not going to happen, would have to involve violence and privation on some level. But there are ways to involve lesser violence, right? Some ways of reducing population and consumption while still violent would consist of decreasing the current levels of violence required and caused by the often forced movement of resources from the poor to the rich, and would of course be marked by a reduction in current violence against the natural world. So he's kind of filling in the blank that I just talked about, which is, you know, owning up to the fact that we live in a society based on a hierarchy of violence, which I don't think that I have any argument against. Maybe you do. That there are some ways that, while they still would involve some of that violence, would be less damaging to the land base and to the people. Personally and collectively, we may be able to both reduce the amount and soften the character of violence that occurs during this ongoing and perhaps long-term shift, or we may not. But this much is certain. If we do not approach it actively, if we do not talk about our predicament and what we're going to do about it, the violence will almost undoubtedly be far more severe, and the privation more extreme. I don't disagree with premise 9 at all, as it stands. I think that this is absolutely defensible, and I think that it builds nicely upon his earlier premises. Problems though there may have been with them, I think we've made at least a good little attempt here to get into Derrick Jensen's philosophy. And I hope for some of you that have sat through my pessimism streams, you're starting to see how foundational he was to my thinking and why. And if you're not, well, we'll talk about that more, I guess, as we go on. I want to hear what you guys think. about this. I am for open borders. He was making a point. He wasn't actually calling for the closing of the border to Mexico. He was making a point that all that people are talking about when they talk about putting a wall up is stopping the flow of immigration from Mexico into the United States. It's going to be business as usual as far as the exploitation of Mexicans goes. So he's making a point. He's not actually calling for the closing of the border, the southern border. You missed the beginning of this. That's fine, man. You can go back and watch it if you're interested. And if not, well, not to watch the next one. The best chat we've literally ever had. It's kind of fun, right? Getting into this stuff. I disagree with him mostly, but agreed on some things. Okay, well, chew on it a little bit. Thanks for your stream, Highdeology. Definitely getting to know your thought process more. I agree with most of it. Cool, man. Cool. Glad you enjoyed it. Environmentalism should have stressed harder that we are the ones fucked if we don't curb ourselves. In the long run, the planet will be fine. Humans, however, won't be around to see it fix itself. Yep, can't disagree there. I think the use of violence for punishment and enforcement of rules is unnecessary. Well, it may be unnecessary, but we're not going to change, which we all agreed on. I mean, not all. I mean, some of you guys might think we're going to just change, but we're not. This guy is full of shit. Wow, what a scathing critique. This was a very insightful look into your reasoning, Paul, and I have to agree with most of it. Thank you. Yeah, cool, man. I'm glad you had fun. More like this, we'll do. We'll do these late night philosophy things. We'll chew through the rest of this video. We'll remember we stopped at premise 9. We've got several more premises to go. We've got 20 premises here. So, when did I discover this guy? It was after I went back to, I told the story on a previous Highdeology, actually kind of recently. I went back to college. I took this crazy class where the professor was very, very liberal. It was an English class, and Ishmael was on the reading list. I took it home, I read it, and it immediately caused me to want to learn more about this kind of thinking, this anti-civilization, rewilding craziness. And that led me to Derek Jensen on YouTube. And he's given a lot of lectures. I've listened to everything I can find. He does a lot of talks on his channel as well. He's still active, still does things, not super often, but he's still out there, still preaching it. So, but it definitely changed the way that I thought about the world running into him. He was a foundational person in my personal philosophy. And going through these things is a really fun exercise, especially for those of you that I think are interested in why I think the way I do. We know you're an eco-terrorist because you want to bring on the nukes. There you go. Sounds like it already played into your subjectivism. Well, it sure did. Played into it nicely. What Mexicans' resources are we taking? He's talking about the economic exploitation of Mexico. Sorry, I saw a little lag spike there. He's talking about the economic exploitation of Mexico. Paul is not going to give up civilization. He just needs McDonald's and the internet. Yeah, that's true. I sure do. What do you think of philosophy classes in college being a complete joke? Is that saddening, or do you think that someone should learn outside of class? I mean, everybody's responsible for their own learning. Going to class doesn't make you not culpable for learning shit. And if you're going to class and not questioning the things that you're being told in that class, then you're not doing it right. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this guy just seems like an extreme utilitarian trying to make the most amount of people healthy at the cost of individual rights. I mean, there's definitely a strong streak of pragmatism and utilitarianism in Derek Jensen's philosophy. But, I wouldn't say that really encapsulates his philosophy. I mean, we still have 10 premises to go here, so we've got quite a way to go before we understand at least the foundational premises that build his philosophy. So we've got some time. We've got some time to spend together listening and learning before we can sum this guy up that neatly. Maybe at the end of this, we'll be able to come up with a sentence or two that encapsulates what we think Derek Jensen's philosophy is. But right now, I'd say we're ill-equipped, or at least you are. I know what his next 10 premises are. I'm familiar and I know how I feel about it. But part of it is going on this journey together. Does the individual have a right to destroy resources others need to live? That's a good question. That's a deeper question that I think I have time to answer because I've got to go rest. I've got to get a little bit of sleep before the day starts tomorrow. But I feel like pointing out that society is built on violence is a bit obvious. I don't feel as though that is a breakthrough observation. Does one have an idea? I mean, maybe for you it isn't, but for me it was. It isn't for me now, but I'd never thought about society in that way before I heard him give this talk. Never. I'd never thought about the his map of hierarchical violence, the top down violence versus the bottom up violence. I'd never thought about it that way. It seems very obvious, but for me it wasn't. Not until I heard this man talk. Hey, tree. It's going pretty good. You caught me right at the end of this. I was just about to sign off for the night. But anyway, good night, everybody. Good night, tree. Sorry to say good night so quickly, but that'll be the end of this. We'll do this again sometime. We'll go through the other 10 premises. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I'll check you guys out later. Bye.